the U.S. government and the U.S. dollar are evidence of an increasingly unattractive debtor. I will say, however, to paraphrase my good friend Doug Casey, that the U.S. dollar is, as usual, the prettiest mare at the slaughterhouse. When I think about the weakness exhibited by the U.S. as a debtor, I'm horrified as an American. And when I compare it to other sovereign jurisdictions, I find it less bad.
Financial expert Rick Rule discusses his concerns about the weakening position of the U.S. government and the U.S. dollar as a debtor. He emphasizes the significant liabilities, both on and off the government's balance sheet, and the lack of attractive alternatives in the market. Rule expresses worry about the depreciating purchasing power of the U.S. dollar, estimating a potential decline of around 7%. He criticizes the low yield and unattractive value proposition offered by long-term U.S. Treasury obligations, especially when considering factors like inflation and taxation. Rule advises viewers to be responsible for their own retirement, given the challenges posed by the existing economic situation. Despite government uncertainties, he advocates understanding one's investments and staying within areas of expertise to mitigate risks. Here's Rick Rule's thesis.
Now, the prettiest mare at the slaughterhouse is not meant to be praised, certainly. I think the thing that holds the market for U.S. Treasuries together is simply the lack of a viable alternative. The U.S. market is easily the most transparent and liquid financial market on the planet. And if you look at the U.S. government's federal balance sheet and you confine your observation to on-balance sheet liabilities, which is to say the pari passu liability that the government has to you and other holders of federal government securities, which is to say $33 trillion in gross obligations, $22 or $23 trillion in net obligations, relative to U.S. government tax receipts, you don't feel too bad. When, however, you juxtapose that with a federal deficit in terms of its ongoing obligations that exceeds $1.7 trillion, but probably more worrying to me when you juxtapose it to the net present value of off-balance sheet liabilities, which is to say entitlements, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, military pensions, unfunded U.S. government pensions, then the circumstance becomes much more worrying. But maybe not more worrying, but as worrying to me, when I look at the value proposition offered up by the long-term U.S. Treasury obligations, they don't seem to be really attractive instruments, even viewed from the prism of a healthy debtor. I don't think that the CPI is a relevant gauge of the deterioration of the purchasing power of U.S. dollars, particularly because the gauge is a pre-tax gauge, not an after-tax gauge. I personally believe, and I'm not going to go way on the limb like the shadow stats people, I personally believe that the deterioration of the purchasing power of the U.S. dollar approaches, if not exceeds, 7%. The prospect of getting paid 5 in a currency which is depreciating at 7 means that, as an example for the U.S. 10-year Treasury, the U.S. government solemnly swears that they will decrease my wealth by 2% a year compounded for 10 years. A promise which I find disquieting, but a promise which I believe that they will keep. So I don't like the credit quality except relative to all the others, and I don't like the yield. That means it's a fairly hard credit for me to buy. I need to say, I am way long the 6 month. I'm willing to lose 2% in the very short term to maintain U.S. dollar liquidity, which I'm afraid I'll find handy at some point in time. But I wouldn't own the 10-year. I mean, it's just very difficult for me to think of a circumstance where I would own the 10-year with this value proposition when the Fed doesn't include food or fuel. I mean, how does that work for me, right? I fly, I eat, And when they don't add tax, as I've told you before, if I didn't have to pay the tax, I wouldn't bitch quite so much about the index. But it makes the index irrelevant. You know, these indexes published by the popular magazines pretend that every person's vision of retirement is the same. My own vision of retirement, as you know, is to recoil with horror at the prospect of it. I am concerned when the indexers talk about places like Iceland and Denmark that they don't take into account the solvency of the retirement system. I mean, interestingly, for myself, if I were going to retire, I've made provisions for my own retirement. And if Social Security doesn't pay me a dime, although I'll be angry about what I put in, it won't change my decision as to what to have for breakfast on the way out. I mean, personally, I would likely, were I to retire to someplace like Argentina and get paid US dollars and spend Argentine pesos. That advice isn't useful for most of your subscribers because they don't have the opportunity to live life as I have. The message, particularly for my younger viewers, is to understand that I have already spent your retirement. My generation voted themselves all kinds of cool benefits, you know, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, all this really nice stuff. We make a lot as baby boomers about the fact that we have $140 trillion in inherited wealth. Well, that's interesting because we're handing you off $140 trillion in recourse and off-balance sheet liabilities, which is a different way of saying we're leaving you nothing. You are going to need to be responsible for your own retirement to the extent that people your age are, irrespective of where they live in the world, going to enjoy retirement. That's really a function of their own preparedness. Well, I do precisely that, not because of the government, ironically, but because of my own limitations. I understand conventional financial services, and I understand natural resources. I maintain that despite the perniciousness of government, that the biggest investment risk that I face is to the left of my right ear and to the right of my left ear. And I have found that to the extent that I pay attention to businesses that I understand, I do well. And when I get outside of my area of expertise, I tend to get spanked, which I don't enjoy. The banking business, irrespective of the climate, is a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful business if you don't make mistakes. To the extent that you make money off the spreads between the price you pay your depositors for their savings and the vigorish, the interest that you're allowed to receive from your borrowers when you lend, it's truly a spectacular business.
Thank you for watching this eye-opening discussion on the challenges facing the U.S. government and the U.S. dollar. In today's conversation with financial expert Rick Rule, we explored the alarming realities of the U.S. as a debtor nation. With $33 trillion in gross obligations and a looming 7% depreciation in the purchasing power of the U.S. dollar, Rule highlighted the pressing concerns about the nation's financial health. He emphasized the importance of understanding these complexities and urged viewers to take control of their financial future. Share your opinions in the comments section below. Remember, being informed and making prudent decisions are essential in today's financial landscape.